The bare bones of the Titanic story are well known and are this. On the night of April 14th and 15th, 1912, on her maiden voyage across the Atlantic to New York, the luxury liner sideswiped an iceberg at about 11:40 p.m. and sank at approximately 1:15 a.m. Of the 2,227 people on board, passengers and crew, 1,502 perished, simply and only, it is thought, because the Titanic did not carry nearly enough lifeboats. However, these unfortunate passengers also perished because our culture has no interest in such a thing as psychically received information or a psychic central premonitions registry. If we flesh out the tale of the Titanic's tragic sinking with human motives, purposes, and goals, and with aesthetics and emotions, we arrive at a far different story than just the bare bones facts, which is this. The Titanic was the second of three nearly identical ocean-going vessels constructed by the White Star Line. The Titanic especially had been designed to be a veritable floating palace containing every luxury passenger's desire. The Titanic was viewed as a monument to human ingenuity and success. Not only was it the epitome of luxury, of man's ingenuity, it was also the largest movable construction man had ever built. As such, it was the symbol of technological things to come. A symbol of speed combined with advancing technology and luxury, a symbol of man's ever-enlarging genius and enterprise that were to give an entirely different shape to the future. Not only was it unique along these lines, but it had been designed to be virtually unsinkable, and so confident were its owners in its unsinkability that they felt lifeboats would never be needed, so they dispensed with many of them in order to enlarge the first-class decks. The Titanic thus symbolized modern confidence, pride, status, prestige, power, and the highest satisfaction that any vision of human success and progress could bring. The very plans of the Titanic made history, as did the laying of its keel and its christening. From its inception, the Titanic was accompanied by enormous press coverage. To be on board during its maiden voyage gave a social cachet of no little consequence, and thus the greats of the times hastened to make their reservations far in advance. On board, among other notables, were the noted author W.T. Stead, the philanthropist Isidor Straus and his wife, the scion of New York, John Jacob Astor and his young bride, the industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim, and Major Archie Butt, the Alexander Haig of his day, who was an advisor to President Taft. On board also were the famous artist Frank Millier, the noted author Jacques Futrelle, and the noted theatrical poet Henry E. Harris. All of these luminaries brought with them combined armies of no less than 31 professional servants to further aid in the luxurious rigors of the Atlantic crossing. The most famous financier of all times, J.P. Morgan, who was scheduled to be on board, canceled at the last minute. The reason given was illness, but we must remember he retained the services of the famous astrologer Evangeline Adams, who was noted for telling people when they should and should not travel. In any event, Morgan's decision not to travel on the Titanic was probably the most fortuitous decision of his life. In a shock that has ceased reverberating to this day, all of the above-mentioned male luminaries went with the other 1,494 souls of the great, lesser great, and ordinary mortals on board into the icy waters along with the Titanic's doomed hulk. The autopsy, in material terms, of why and how the Titanic sank was front-page news for 10 years afterwards, and in fact is still argued today, especially recently when the ship's remains were discovered on the ocean floor. Dozens of books and 5 movies have been produced. There's a Titanic Historical Society, and the sinking is observed by annual ceremony. The very mentioning of the sinking of the Titanic to people who have never heard of it and know nothing of its details inexplicably brings up in them a moment's pause, as if something in their mental clickings misses a beat, as if the event is actually impressed upon our collective consciousness. In keeping with the premise that such events are always foreshadowed by psychic alerts, certainly these alerts must have been available well in advance of the actual sinking itself. And indeed they were. In spades, as they say. Yet typical of our present anti-psychic stance, which stridently avoids such information, you will find none of the Titanic's psychic alerts in any history book. Yet, a psychic autopsy of the tragedy has been done. It goes something like this. The first apparent act of the Titanic psychic sequence began 14 years before the ship was even a dream in the minds of the owners of the White Star Line. In 1898, a relatively unknown seaman, one Morgan Robertson, wrote and published a fictional story entitled The Wreck of the Titan. In his story, Robertson pictured the Titan as a huge, luxurious fast liner that was designed to be unsinkable. The company that had built her was out to make speed records in crossing the Atlantic. The Titan began her maiden voyage in early April, and on board were the beautiful people of two worlds, Europe and America. As the Titan sped along the northern travel routes of the Atlantic, she struck an iceberg due to the unconscionable speed she had been traveling in the dangerous iceberg-infested waters. Her, quote, unsinkable design did not save her, and hundreds of people needlessly perished, because in order to hold more first-class passenger cabins, the company had done away with the lifeboats enough to hold in case of disaster at sea. And in fact, many people had refused to board what lifeboats there were because they believed in the myth of the vessel's unsinkability. The loss of life was appalling. 14 years after Robertson had published his story about the disaster of the Titan, it proved to be an almost exact pre-play of the actual Titanic tragedy. If we line up the details of the fictional and actual event that resemble each other, we find as follows. Number of propellers: Titan, 3, Titanic, 3. Displacement tonnage of the liner: Titan, 75,000, Titanic, 66,000. Length of liner in feet: Titan, 800, Titanic, 882.5. Speed at impact with iceberg: Titan, 25 knots, Titanic, 23 knots. Number of persons aboard: Titan, 3,000, Titanic, 2,227. Number of lifeboats: Titan, 24, Titanic, 20. In 1912, the Titanic neared completion, and people were competing with each other to reserve their space on the maiden voyage. The impending destruction of the ship began to leak into knowledge through psychic means, through dreams, visions, and premonitions. Psychologist and parapsychological researcher Ian Stevenson has collected 19 examples of these psychic linkages, which he believes stands up under scientific scrutiny, but there were many more, many of them published in news media shortly after the sinking. Dr. Stevenson lists 19 acceptable premonitions. But there were also implicit premonitions. For example, the number of cancellations of reservations for this particular voyage was unprecedented in spite of the great social prestige to be derived from traveling on the maiden voyage. The cancellations mystified the owners of the White Star Lines, but what matter, since there were a line of notables eager to benefit from someone else's cancellation. At least 3 seamen inexplicably jumped from the ship when it docked at Southampton before setting out into the Atlantic proper. One of those later interviewed said, "I just knew the son of a bitch was going down." Some passengers who had reserved space received cables from relatives or friends asking them not to go on the maiden voyage, but to change to another ship. The distinguished journalist and editor W.T. Stead lost his life aboard the Titanic. Stead had a deep interest in the occult and psychic stuff, and for some years had been obtaining communications through automatic writing from a spirit named Julia. In the 1880s, Steve published a warning he had received from Julia that a great ocean liner would sink. And in 1909, Steve would give a lecture to the Cosmos Club in New York in which he pictured himself as shipwrecked and calling for help. In 1911, Steve consulted with the famous astrologer psychic Count Louis Hamon, Chiro, who we will encounter later in the pages ahead. Chiro told Steed that danger to his life would be from water and from nothing else. On June 21st, 1911, Chiro advised Steed through a letter that travel would be dangerous for him in the month of April 1912. Yet despite Steed's own belief in the occult, and almost in spite of Chiro's warnings, Steed boarded the unsinkable Titanic in the month of April 1912. We can only assume that Chiro's warnings were ringing in Steed's ears as he plunged to the bottom along with the doomed vessel. We might at this point well conclude our recounting of psychic stuff connected with the Titanic sinking. After all, we've picked up on the main idea that many people pierced into the network or mix of psychic factors surrounding the event. But we really should try to get some idea of what these factors were by resorting to astrology, for example, and having a look at the Titanic's several horoscopes. The most fundamental idea behind astrology, as behind all the psychic arts and crafts, is that invisible energies and forces do exist. These exist in a wide spectrum of many different but identifiable qualities, and these qualities contribute to, or sometimes, quote, ordain how things turn out. Although their spectrum is wide, they can be divided into two general categories: those that are constructive and those that are destructive. Or, put another way, those that contribute to a constructive destiny or a destructive fate. Although modern astrologers have never been able to explain why it should be so, over 6,000 years ago they began to notice that each degree of the 360-degree zodiac, the planets themselves, as well as their relationships to each other, and the fixed stars were factors somehow representative of invisible energies and forces with regard to what we now call how things turn out. In other words, by erecting a horoscope, a chart of the planets at the time of their quote birth, astrologers could see what mix of invisible energies and forces was to be active with regard to how things probably were going to turn out for a particular person or undertaking. A horoscope can be erected for just about anything, including racehorses and stock market ventures. The several horoscopes we can study regarding the Titanic's astrological factors reveal some chilling aspects. For example, the decision to build the Titanic took place in March of 1907, and the financing of it was successfully achieved at that time. For what it's worth, in March of 1907, Saturn, the baleful planet of death, was lurking on the 23rd degree of Pisces. Pisces is the astrological sign of the zodiac that governs, among other things, the oceans and the seas. In astrological lore, the 23rd degree of Pisces has to do with the idea that anything embarked upon for material gain will spell ruin. Saturn, at this point, is sure to confirm the impending ruin. All three of the White Star's sister ships, the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, were thus commenced under this unfortunate aspect, and all three met with physical and financial disaster, although the Olympic was the luckiest of the three. However, after the decision to build the unfortunate three was concluded, the commencement of building each ship began at different times, and thus has slightly different astrological factors from that point on. The keel for the Titanic was laid down on 31 March 1909, when the baleful planet Saturn was now conjunct the Sun, indicating that the ship's glory would be overtaken by death. And this conjunction was square Neptune, lord of the oceans and ruler of Pisces, indicating that disaster would come at sea. I feel obliged to point out that this is not hindsight talking. Any competent astrologer would have concluded that the Titanic was in for rough times. As if this were not enough, when the Titanic was launched, which is to say, first met water, on 31 May 1911, the destructive planet Mars was occupied passing over the 23rd degree of Pisces, the same negative aspect of ruin under which the ship got started in the first place. The night the Titanic sank, 14 April 1912, the trek of Saturn had brought it to the 19th degree of Taurus, which, in astrological lore, is associated with travel to the New World and passivity, hopelessness, and weakness. In astrological terms, the Titanic project was hopeless from the start, and clearly when it did sink, it did so from weakness emanating from the idea that it was unsinkable in the first place. Many of those who drowned did so because they believed in the myth of the ship's unsinkability and passively refused to get into the lifeboats at all. Thus, in astrological terms, it can be seen that the three vessels were all ruled by the baleful planet Saturn. The Olympus was the luckiest of the three unfortunates. During her ocean-going career, the Olympic suffered no less than 6 major collisions with other boats, necessitating costly repairs, but remained in existence until 1937, when she was dismantled for scrap. The Titanic's other sister ship, the Britannic, originally to be called Gigantic prior to the Titanic sinking, was converted to a hospital ship during World War I, the professions of medicine and hospital nursing also being associated with Saturn's death and life activity. She was sunk in the Key Channel in the Aegean Sea in 1916 by a mine or torpedo. All three vessels brought enormous financial ruin to the White Star Line. Now, Don't bother to ask me how or why all this should be as it is. I don't know. But the astrological correspondences to how things turn out, i.e., how the invisibles will manifest themselves, are obvious enough. Clearly, the directors of the White Star Line might have benefited differently by consulting a few astrologers.
Well, you're not